G'day, Geoffrey here. I've got a challenge. How efficient is your breeding herd? Do you really know? If I came onto your place and I asked you that question, how are your cows performing? I suspect a lot of producers really can't answer that question. We use various numbers, things that are traditional measures, but to specifically and objectively answer that question, I think a lot of people would have serious troubles. And secondly, what's really driving the ability of cows to perform well in a breeding herd? Do you really know that? I think people say they do, but when critically asked, I think sometimes that information is missing. So, if we have a breeding herd, what's your business? Well, in very simple terms, it's making beef at a cost. Interestingly enough, it's not much different to making beef with steers. So if you put 100 tonne of steers in a paddock and say they are 30% efficient, that means the following year their production will be about 30 kilograms. So you will have 30 tonnes. So you'll have 130 tonnes of steers in the paddock next year. They have a production efficiency of 30%. But what is the production efficiency in a northern breeding herd? How much meat is actually being produced? We know for steers, but do we know for breeding herds? And when we use our traditional measures, such as terms like weaning rate, are they useful measures? Do they really measure how much meat is being produced? And as I've just said before, how can you increase your production and efficiency if you find that your beef production efficiency is not at an optimum level? One of the big challenges with the breeding herd business, and why we don't know the answers to these questions in the past, is that measurement's actually quite difficult. One of the problems is the herd dynamics is always changing. So unlike steers, where you put them in the paddock and leave them there for a while and measure them quite easily, with cows, we're chucking cows in and out, pulling bulls in and out, pulling weaners out. Cows are dying. Very difficult to monitor. The second thing happens that from the time you think about putting a bull in to the time you wean the last calf with a mob, it's anything up to 2 years. We try and think about it as a 1-year event, or make measures over a 1-year event, and we're actually only measuring half an event. So that makes measurement quite difficult. So that's the background to the Cash Cow project, why it exists. So in the Cash Cow project, what we've set about doing is trying to find ways where we can measure the achievable performance of a northern breeding herd in your situation. What can you do? Secondly, what is happening in your specific commercial situation? Not next door, not in the best paddock, but in the paddock where you've got your cows. What is happening? That's against what I just outlined, the achievable performance. And thirdly, if things aren't happening as they should, why aren't they? So it's a pretty big project, this Cash Cow Cash Cow project. You can see that all those dots relate to individual properties, and on each property we had at least one, but sometimes in most of them at least 2 mobs. And they were distributed across Downs country, Brigalow mixed forest, southern forest and northern forest regions. They are interim classifications of land types. It may change as we further analyse our data. We monitored over 70,000 cows. I think 78 was the number, 78,000 for 2 to 3 full reproductive cycles. Depends how long each property was involved. That's a massive job. And we're analysing the data against environmental factors, and they're the things that you can't do much about, and the cost management factors. They're the things you can do something about. So that was a big So it's been a big project for a big team, and that's the reason for the large cost. So if you're measuring beef production and beef production efficiency of a breeding herd, as Michael McGowan is trying to do here, you actually have to measure what's making beef with cows at a cost. So cows make beef by becoming pregnant, producing a calf that survives, the cow survives, and it produces weight itself because you actually sell it. That's actually finally, the weight of the weaner is pretty important, and then you have to put that against the costs. One of the issues that one of the main issues that people have trouble getting their head around is the cow weight story, because you keep cows from year to year, and the cow might gain weight and lose weight over a period of time, but you don't actually sell it to the end, and you don't sell 10% of a cow every year, but you do sell maybe 10% of your cows every year, and therefore those cows that you sell represent the accumulated weight that cows have, and that represents their salvage value. So it is important that we measure cow weight. The measure of production efficiency needs to measure biological profit efficiency and profitability. We need unambiguous language. We need to know what each other's talking about. And finally, I iterate, we need to have performance in specific situations, and that relates to in specific environment situations. So the reproduction in North Australia, and probably right across the world in beef cattle, I call it a language disaster zone. So this is an illustration of that. We got this old bloke down the beach here, and he's telling his mate over here that he's got a really good horse. And Professor Michael is actually thinking about this really special little weapon that he's got at home in the clover. And old mate, he's an experienced ringer, and he's thinking about something he's going camp drafting with. And that might sound a little bit silly, but in reality, it's what happens. People think something, they turn it into words, someone listens, and they turn that into a picture. And those two pictures can be completely different. And that's one of the biggest problems with our reproductive language in the beef breeding herd. So we use the term weaning rate. What does it mean? Is it number of calves? Is it number of calves per cow mated the previous year? Is it the number of calves per cow kept the last year? Is it the number of calves per cows in the yard? I don't know, there might be a few more definitions out there. Is it number of calves over a specific period? Lots of people aren't telling each other lies, but there's huge variation in what that means, and people can tell each other completely different weaning rates but actually mean the same thing, which means that is a very problematic term and very difficult to communicate with. First calf cow. Some people call a first calf cow a female that's never been to a bull, so she's ready to go for her first calf, a young heifer. Some people, amazingly enough, call a first calf cow an animal that has had her first calf and is going to the bull, has been to the bull for a second time and is now in her second pregnancy. Now that might sound pretty silly, but I've actually experienced that and variations in between across the beef industry. Again, we've got a language disaster. Body condition. Now, many will tell you that reproduction is about nutrition, and that is absolutely correct. And body condition, funnily enough, it represents what happens in condition. Now, the issue about body condition is that no matter where you go, you seem to have a different body condition scoring system, and here is our most important measure in reproduction, and we can't even get the terminology or the language right there. The problem that we've really got is that we try to think in numbers. 1 to 5 scale, 1 to 9 scale, 1 to 6 scales, we have fat scores, condition scores. It's a proper disaster zone. I contend that thinking in numbers is the incorrect way to do it. And in cash cow, we've approached it from what we believe is the correct way, which is to think in descriptions. And if you think in description, the simple strategy is to say something is moderate, something is better than average, something is below average, something is brilliant, or it's shocking. Right? Now, that's a simple 5-point scale. That's how we can condition score. You can teach an experienced cattleman to condition score in about 30 seconds if you use that approach. If you say to that person, tell me a forward conditioned cow or a score 4 cow, use that approach, they can point one out immediately and get it pretty well right. If you really want a 10-point scale, we'll just go, it's not moderate, it's a bit better than that. It's not actually good condition, it's a bit less than that. Well, that's a score 3.5. So you think a description, turn it into a number, and you really need to use a 5-point scale to use that approach. And we find that works excellently, and we hope that that strategy will permeate throughout the beef industry. In cash cow, we've done a lot of intensive monitoring, and what we've done is monitored overall performance of cows in very detailed ways, and then try to come up with ways that maybe commercial people can use that are indicators of these detailed measures that they can't measure. We're also measuring what happens within environmental zones, so how people are going to compare one against the other. I would just, at this stage, clearly indicate that the data I'm about to present is raw data. It's not corrected for age and lactation status and a number of things like that. So please beware that this initial data is indicating trends. Now, one of the measurements that we've used in the cash cow project, a number of the measures that producers can use in a commercial situation and measures that we've used in the cash cow project are these. If you have a fetal aging muster, or traditionally called a preg testing muster, you can measure the percent pregnant. And we're suggesting a good measure is the percent pregnant 4 months after calving. That might seem a bit tricky, and I'll just come back to that in a moment because it's really not as tricky as it sounds. The second measurement you can keep is this: when you're finished with your managing your herd for a particular year, how many pregnant cows did you keep over to the following year? Pretty simple. And then, for a number of different groups, how many are there and what's the average weight? Now, you don't have to weigh everything, just a representative sample. And the first of these is, of the cows that you kept from one year to the next, say if you did your last weaning in September, how many cows did you keep in a paddock and what's their average weight? In the following year, say this year, overall musters, how many cows did you sell? What's their average weight? Over that same year, how many weaners did you wean? And what is their average weight? It's pretty simple stuff. Then you start to go into the second year. Repeat from one year to the next. So examples of a herd from the Brigalow area. We did a fetal aging muster. We found 199 pregnant out of 265 mustered at that muster. So they were in the ideal period for conception, but we kept more of those cows, of pregnant cows, and we found that there were more pregnants, and in this case there were 237 pregnant cows kept. But no empties were actually kept from one year to the next. The 237 cows, a sample was taken. They weighed 482 kg. During this year, there were 67 cows sold, average weight of 514 kg. There were 196 weaners, and the best guess, or best estimate from sample weighing was 193 kg of those weaners. Then we go on to the following year when there were 210 cows put back into that paddock at 471 kilograms. It's pretty simple data. The incredible thing about this data is you can actually calculate extraordinarily powerful information from that raw data. So let's have a look at this percent pregnant 4 months after calving. It's a pretty simple practical measure. In the Cash Cow project, we were able to do it by annual fetal aging with animal identification. Now, most producers don't allow themselves that opportunity because of the expense of doing it. However, it's essentially very similar to the number of lactating cows that are pregnant after a typical 3 months control mating period. And this is a representation of what we found in the Cash Cow project. You'll see here on the left hand side of this figure the 4 different land types that I described to you earlier. Now, if we just take the Downs land type, we look along the bottom here and we can see that this gives the range. So this is nothing got pregnant within 4 months of calving. This is 100% got pregnant within 4 months of calving. And we have a figure here which represent the variation that occurred on the Downs. Now, in this figure there are 5 vertical lines. It's called a box and whisker plot. Now, the middle vertical line in the box is what's called the median, and that means that to the left of that line is half the herds, and to the right of the line is the other half of the herds. The outside lines is the extreme best and the extreme worst. The left-hand edge of the box is the 25% mark, and the right-hand side of the box is the 75% mark. And where higher is better, what we are saying in the Cash Cow project is that the right-hand edge of this box is the achievable level under commercial situations in our current situation or scenario. So you can see that in the Downs country within the Cash Cow project, which represented a lot of different seasonal conditions and management and that sort of stuff, the median was about 70% pregnant within 4 months of calving. Some were achieving about 85% pregnant within 4 months of calving. The very worst were about 45%. Interestingly enough, the median didn't vary a lot across the better country in North Australia, the Southern Forest, the Brigalow and the Downs, but there's a lot of variation within those land types, which would suggest potentially a lot of variation in seasons and a lot of variation in management. And that indicates that there's opportunity to improve this particular parameter, because if you don't get pregnant, don't have calves, cows aren't making beef. The other interesting thing that happen is that in the northern forest, that is distinctly different. So the median is below 20%, it's close to 15%. The very best of herds in the northern forest country are only just getting into the box zone of the better country. So you can see it is quite different, the northern forest, from a reproduction point of view to the good country. Huge variation. In the example data I gave you before, there was the Brigalow country. From the number of cows pregnant that were tested at that fetal aging muster, there was 75%. So you can see on that graph, in that particular herd, that operator was 75%, which is very close to the achievable level, certainly above the median level. So doing pretty well. Another note here is that this is the achievable level in these particular regions. So, in the good country, it's around about 80% achievable of pregnancy rate. 80% pregnancy rate 4 months after calving. If you think that's not good enough and try to push it higher, it may not be cost effective. This is where, if you go higher than the right hand edge of these, higher than this achievable level or the right hand edge of the box, that's suggesting that you may be getting into the cost inefficient zone. We need to do further work to verify that. Let's look at Carfloss. So you've got a pregnancy, then you have to keep it. It's a practical measure, and it's quite simply the percentage loss of confirmed pregnancies prior to weaning. So if I have 100 pregnancies, I end up with 90 calves, I've lost 10%. And this is what we found in our project. So the interesting thing is, once again, in the better country, the medians don't vary hugely, but again the northern forest is well outside or much worse than the other areas, which is quite interesting because we thought originally that the Downs was going to be an area with a problem, the biggest problem with Carfloss, and it's actually turned out to be the Northern Forest area. Certainly what's interesting in no matter which zone you go into, even the better zones, there are still instances where there are quite severe calf losses, 15% or more, no matter where you go in some cases. You can see this as raw data because the achievable level in this case is not the right hand edge of the box but the left hand edge of the box, and 0% in southern forest is definitely not achievable. It's probably closer to about 2 to 3% in this better country. The median is going to be in the 5 to 6 range. But when you get into the northern forest, you can see that you've got a totally different kettle of fish. That it is actually quite difficult to get below 10%. Or the achievable level is about a little bit less than 10%. So if you're losing 10% in northern forest, you're doing quite well. If you're losing about 13%, you're about average, and you've got the opportunity to improve. So again, all regions are experiencing high loss. In the example I had before, using the data that was collected in that example brigalow herd, there was 17% loss, which is what can happen. So that herd, he had a higher than average number of pregnancies within 4 months of calving, but lost a lot of calves for whatever reason. The next term I want to introduce is weaner production. Notice I haven't used that horrible weaning rate term. You'll find me hearing it from time to time, and it's okay to use it as long as you define it, but I won't use it where I'm not defining it. So here we're going to talk about weaner production. Again, it's a practical measure, and to measure it we need average weaner weight, the number of weaners that we wean, and the number of cows we preg tested the previous year. They were 3 of the numbers that I outlined in that slide. Now this is a pretty interesting slide. Essentially it's, how much weaner meat are you producing per number of cows that you had available. And you can see here again that the northern forest is lower than the other regions, but there's a bit of spread between the other regions. There tends to be, particularly as you go south, that the weaner production, or kilograms per cow per year, tends to be higher. What's really intriguing about this particular graph is the median. And if you look at the median, for the northern forest it's about 100 kilograms per cow per year. Southern forest it's up like about 170, 175. In the Downs and the Brigalow it's about 150. Now that figure just happens to be very similar to the sort of steer growth that occurs on average in those regions. Particularly if you, and not so much the median, but if you look towards the achievable level. So if you look towards the achievable level of say about 120, 125 in the northern forest, southern forest over 200, Brigalow about 185, the Downs about 155, they're typical annual steer growth patterns. So what that's saying is that, if you've got country that's say 160 kilograms a year steer growth, that's a really good indication of the sort of weaner production you should be able to get out of your paddock. Now it's not just about number of weaners. You must bring the weight of the weaners into the question, because that relates to conception patterns, which is pretty important, and it also relates to you've got to put it against the number of cows preg tested, because you've got to compare apples with apples. If you get a small number of cows conceiving within 4 months of calving, you've got to be able to compare them accurately with other cows that haven't had a small number of pregnancies within 4 months of calving. Again, there's huge variation. In the example herd that we had, if we took those numbers, we can work out that it was 142 kilograms per cow. which is actually below the median, and this is to do with that calf loss. The final major parameter I want to introduce is breeder beef production efficiency. Now this is something that's actually a little bit tricky to measure. We call it the gold standard, and it's the kilograms of live weight produced per kilograms of cattle in the paddock. So it's a bit like that example I used with steers before. If I put 100 kilograms of steers in, I pull out 130 the next year, that's 30% efficiency. We can do that with cows, and it's a very good measure of their reproduction and growth performance and survival of breeder herds. We express it as a percentage, as I've outlined, and this is the sort of thing that occurs. The interesting thing is that there's not a lot of variation in the median between the good country, even though steer growth is higher in the better country. And this is because cows in better country, the better the country, the bigger the cows and the bigger the calves. Also, in better country, they have more grass, so the stocking rates are higher, the costs are similar, so the overall profitability of better country is a lot higher, even though the individual efficiency per cow is actually quite similar. But we still need to know that cows are doing an efficient job that they were designated to do in that particular environment. And you can see that in this better country that the efficiency levels are around about, the achievable efficiency level is about 45%, but there's plenty of herds that are doing a lot more worse than that. But when you get into the northern forest, your efficiency level is only about 35%, which is well below the better country. We have plenty of situations where it's well below that, and you can see in this particular presentation here that there's actually the overall variation is quite high, quite extraordinarily high. So this upper level or achievable level is nearly double, you know, the left-hand side of the box, which is, you know, the back end of the industry. That's not good, and it just shows the level of opportunity we've got to do to improve breeder beef production efficiency in our herds. In the herd example herd we used, it was 27%, which is actually below median, and that particular herd's got a lot of potential to improve, obviously by dealing with calf mortality. As I said before, bigger cows have bigger calves, and better country, cows are bigger. And this is just a simple example of, you know, the average weight of cows in our project in the northern forest was less than 400. It was close to 500 in the brigalow, and in between for the southern forest and the downs. So cow weights are much higher in better country. So what's our conclusions? I think we've got a better language which is unambiguous and useful. I've shown you that simple measures of the cattle and the environment measures I've used in this particular simple presentation is the land type, and that'll give you some idea of your achievable performance, and I've outlined that by that edge of the box in the box and whisker plot. And I've given you an idea that if you take some simple measures, you can find where your specific herd sits against the achievable level. What's really interesting in our cash cow project is we've found quite substantial variation in breeder production efficiency due to management and due to seasons, and it's much more than that due to class of country, even though there is quite a difference between the northern forest and the better country. And finally, unexplained calf loss continues to be a major cause of reproductive loss. Thank you.